Hi everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Digital Film Dojo. Today, we're going to be diving into doing color correction and color grading in Premiere. This is going to be a step-by-step tutorial on how to look at a scene that you've already cut together and try to figure out the best way to go about color correcting and color grading it, based on the shots that you have and how they compare to each other. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and download the files from the link below in the description. And in those files, you're going to see a Premiere file already made in there and some source videos. And when you open the Premiere file, you're going to see this already cut footage here of the scene from a film that I did a couple years ago. And this is the scene we're going to be working with for this tutorial. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and download that now. So with our project open, we already have everything set up here. We have the scene cut pretty well. Things are still a little bit rough, but for this purposes, we don't need it to be perfect. The main reason we're working with the whole scene here is because when you're working with color correction, you're not just working with clips individually. You're really color correcting and color grading for the whole scene that you're working with. For color correction, we're going to want to make all of our shots in a scene look pretty consistent in terms of lighting and color temperature and white balance and whatnot. And after done with that, we're going to want to establish a whole tone to our scene by using color grading with a whole couple of different tools that we have here in Premiere. So the first thing you'll notice when you look at this footage is it's very desaturated and it's very low contrast. This is because this film was shot in log, and if you remember from my last video, shooting in log gives you this type of picture, and shooting in log gives you the most color information to use in post-production. What's even better is this footage was shot on a red, so it's raw video information. We're going to have even more leeway to work with when we're doing color. So this scene's going to be a really good one to work with for practicing color correction and color grading. So because we're shooting log, there's going to be an extra step that we have to do in order to truly start color correcting for a scene. We're going to want to normalize our footage, so meaning we want to bring the colors and the contrast to a sort of normal camera look. It's sometimes hard to tell the natural white balance or exposure that is in our shot. So the color effect that we're going to be using for this tutorial is going to be Luma Color, which is a plugin that they have for Premiere. And the best thing about Luma Color is it's an effect that has a whole bunch of tools built into it. So whichever type of tools that you like to use for color correction has pretty much all of them here for you. So the first step I like to do when I'm building color from log is I like to go to the RGB curves here. That's about in the middle of our Luma Color. And if you also want to, you can search RGB curves here. It's on its own. They have it here in Premiere if you just want to use that instead of the whole Luma Color set. The one big thing you notice about log is the contrast. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to bring some contrast back into these shots here. We're going to work with the black and white ends for our curves here to add in these factors separately so we can kind of decide how much we want to bring in for black and for white. For this scene and a lot of log footage, the black levels are pretty high, so we're going to go ahead and crush those down a bit to start out. And what you're going to notice here when we do this, you're going to see some darkness come back into her hair, into his jacket here, and it's going to start to look pretty nice. And then we're going to go up here to the top and we're going to bring the white levels up a bit. So the way the curves here basically work is everything down on this end works with your blacks and everything down here on the top works with your whites. Anything kind of in the middle here will work with your midtones a bit, and it'll kind of affect pretty much everything in your shot. But for right now, we're going to leave that be. Might work with that a little bit more. But for right now, we're just going to work with our blacks and whites here. So again, bringing the blacks this direction is going to bring them down, which will make things darker. And bringing the whites coming this direction is going to bring them up, making them brighter. Okay, cool. So we have some contrast back in here. We're starting to see the colors a bit more. We see kind of the orange and kind of green colors here. This must have been shot with a pretty warm white balance, and it makes sense because it is a sunny day. What we're going to do is we're going to bring up the exposure just a little bit. So now we're going to kind of go into our mid-tone areas of the curves. I really like using the curves a bit because it's a more graphical and a more visual representation of the contrast and the exposure you're seeing instead of just kind of looking at numbers here. But again, it really comes down to preference, but this is kind of just the way I like to do it here. I'm going to bring up the exposure just a little bit by kind of going in the mid-tones, and we're going to have kind of something like this. And we really don't have to do much more because right now all we're doing is kind of normalizing the scene. We're not doing any specific color correction or specific color grading here. We can fiddle with these a little bit more, but I'm not going to just yet. The one last thing I might want to do here is I might want to add just a little bit more saturation just to bring up the colors just a bit more so we can accurately see what they are. And yeah, so that's pretty good for what we're gonna do right now. That's all we're gonna need to do for this step, is just bring back some of that color, a little bit of that saturation and contrast in, so we can accurately see kind of the colors more in this shot. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna do that for all of our different shots here. And rather you watch me go ahead and do that for each shot, we're just gonna go skip ahead to where all of the shots in our sequence are normalized. So if you want to, go ahead and do that step now. Go ahead through your footage and normalize the footage. If you don't want to, you can go ahead and skip to the next sequence where everything is going to be normalized, and you can work from there. Okay, so now we're on the normalized track here. We have all of our footage normalized. Everything looks pretty good. We can see an accurate picture of the colors here, and this is good because now it's the time of the step where we want to pick a shot in our scene that we think most accurately represents the colors that we want when we're shooting on that day. And it's not just exactly the colors that we felt best represented the environment that we shot that day, it's the best kind of color temperature and exposure that we think will look best for our scene. So there's a couple different color temperatures that we're seeing here. This shot and the other shot with the note are kind of a little bit more cooler, a bit more blue, because I think the sun was a little lower when we shot those. And then we have a couple shots where they're a bit warmer. It looks really nice because the sun was setting at a good time here. And we have a couple of outliers, maybe like this shot here. It's not necessarily warm or cool that we have this shot. Because of the way this is angled and the content that's in the shot, we're seeing a little bit more of a greener tint here. So there are a couple different things that we have to pick from, but what I think I'm going to go with is the more warmer shots that we have. This is one of the ones I kind of like the most out of the sequence here. This is the type of color I want to go with. And the one thing before we're going to move on, we're going to work with the exposure just a little bit more, since the skin is just a little dark here in the shadow a bit. Let's go ahead and bring that up a little bit by using our curves. What we can do here, now that we're moving on, we can go over to the exposure tool here and just push that up just a little tiny bit. Nothing too crazy, but just something where we can see everything nice and exposed here. And this is looking pretty good. Maybe just a little too high on the darks here. So yeah, this is looking at a pretty nice place. It's okay if his skin's a little bit dark because this kind of shot has a lot of dynamic range. Footage that's shot kind of in the dark still has a lot of detail, and it still looks nice, especially when you're working with footage in log and especially shot on red. And for this type of shot, since this is the color temperature that we're going for, we don't have to really do much with the color temperature here. We can kind of keep that the same. And as far as saturation, maybe we can bring that up just a little bit. Probably in our grading process, I'm going to probably bring this up just a little bit since it was starting out in log. There's a lot of nice colors in this scene, so we're going to really want to show them off. Cool, so I think the shot's at a pretty good place now. What we're going to do here is we're going to frame our other shots that we have in the sequence kind of based off of the values that we have in this shot here. We're not going to go ahead and copy this information over to other shots because other shots have different color temperature, other shots have different exposure that we're going to work with. We're going to try to kind of match their adjustments to the ones that we made here. So to use that for a reference, there's a couple ways to do it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take a snapshot. And I'm going to make sure I have import into my project checked here. So it's going to pop up into my project here on the side. So we have this frame here of reference that we can use. And for the time being right now, I'm just going to go ahead and stick this over here next to my program monitor. So I have them kind of side by side. So if I go through other shots here, I can still see the scene that we're referencing to, and I can also still have my color tools over here. It's pretty much up to you how you want to organize your windows. This is the best way that I use it with the setup that I have. So let's go ahead and jump to this shot here where it looks a little bit cooler. So the main thing that we want to do for this shot is we're going to want to just bring the color temperature a bit warmer a bit. So let's go ahead to the temperature tool here and lumetri color. That's in our basic color, that's in our basic corrections tab here. And bringing that up already, we're already going to see a major difference here. The best thing to look at, take a look at his skin tone here and here. We want to try to get that to match as much as we can, and it's actually doing a pretty good job. It's not going to look exactly the same because the lighting situations are a bit different. He's got a little bit more light shining on him here rather than here. But even just doing that, we're seeing things look a little bit more similar to the other shot already. So another thing that we can do is we can raise the saturation up a bit on this shot just to kind of match the amount that we had on there. Maybe it's just a little bit more because it looks like the color's a little bit more muted in this shot coming out of the gate. So that might help a little bit. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of raise the exposure a bit here by working with these midtones a bit more. Things are looking pretty good here. Another thing I noticed in this shot there's a little bit more of magenta going on here in the water and a little bit in his face. So I'm gonna go over to the tint tool here and our basic color correction. And with the tint tool here, it basically works with your greens and your magentas. And what I'm gonna do is if we see doing that right here, we're gonna see how we can kind of, if you pull it to the extremes, you can see which way does which. And I'm just gonna bring that down just a little tad bit toward the magenta side, just to get a little bit, maybe even just a little less. Honestly, just a little bit more. We can see a little bit more of the red appearing in the water, which we kind of have here. I mean, this is always a good step to really just do a little fine details here and there. You want things to look the way that you think they're going to look best for your film. And don't be afraid to bring things to the extremes sometimes just to see what they'll do, you know, in order to see if you're going in the right direction or not. There's a lot of different tools that we have here. There's a lot of different things that we could try. And the more stuff that you find, that you experiment with, the more interesting looks you're going to find for your film. So I think this could just be a little tad bit more warm. Yeah, and I think this is in a pretty good spot. I think this is the best that we're going to get when comparing the two here. So now let's jump to kind of a different shot here. So this shot looks like it has some same color temperature as it does with our reference shot here. So there's probably not a lot that we have to do in that aspect of it. The one big thing I noticed about this shot compared to this shot is because the angle is different, the lighting is pretty different as well. So the colors are going to look slightly different when we look at from this angle compared to this angle. So I think what I'm going to do first is I'm going to bring up the exposure just a little bit more and kind of see where we can go from there. And by doing that, we can really kind of show that the light is coming from this direction, which is where it is coming from. So it kind of shows that these scenes kind of work together here. I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit more. I'm going to add a little bit more black in here just to show a little bit more detail and texture here in her hair and in his jacket here. I think another thing that we can do is we can go ahead and go to our green and magenta tint and pull a little bit more magenta. A bit more. There's a lot of green going on in this shot, and just bringing this up a little bit is kind of match what we have here in the other shot. Something to consider too, because of this angle, since the colors are going to look a little different, bringing up the saturation a lot may not work as much for this shot because it's going to look more saturated than this shot. We might want to just kind of keep it to where it was, just maybe a little slightly more than where it was. Because when you have this kind of lighting situation, colors might not look as saturated compared to if you have a lighting situation like this where the sun is basically directly on her. And let's probably bring our highlights down a little bit. We don't want to try to blow things out too much. And yeah, that's kind of at a good place, I think, as well. Sometimes when I'm doing color corrections, I like to turn it off and turn it back on again to see the difference. And yeah, I think that's looking at a pretty good place to move on from here. And a cool thing about color correction is because this shot is the exact same as this shot, what we can do is we can go ahead and take the correction that we did in this shot and go ahead and copy it onto this shot here. So that's one fewer shot that we have to work with. And thinking about that too, we can also take the correction that we did from our reference shot and we can go ahead and put it on this shot as well, since it's from the same angle. And the one last shot I'm going to want to look here before we move on is this shot here. Like I mentioned before, we're kind of dealing with something a little bit different here. It's not necessarily the cool tones or the warm tones that we're dealing with in this shot. It's more along the lines of our greens and magentas that we want to work with. We kind of see that the color temperature is on point when we're looking at both of these. Could probably just use a little bit more warmth onto it, but probably not too much. Bring that down just a little bit. And the first thing I kind of noticed, I think things are looking at just a little bit too green, so I'm gonna move up my magenta a little bit. Now you see when I moved that up a little bit, it was a little bit more of a drastic change than the other shots. So you want to be pretty conservative when we're dealing with that. And another thing that we can do is we can go back down here to the curves, and we can go onto that green and magenta track here. And we can kind of move things around individually. And I'm going to go into the blacks here, and I'm going to pull down the greens just a little bit to kind of take some of the greens out of the black here. You know, it's not too much going on here, and just that kind of helped a little bit. I'm pretty pleased with what that did. Maybe if we go into the whites and pull a little bit of the magenta out of there, kind of add a little bit more green, we're kind of getting a more accurate, we're getting kind of a more accurate look of the water here compared to this shot. But other than doing that, there's not a lot I feel like that we have to do with exposure. Maybe just pull it up just a little with exposure here. It's looking pretty good. Maybe just pull the blacks down just a tad bit. But other than that, yes, it's looking pretty good to move on from here. Okay, so now we're going to move on to color grading these clips. If you'd like to, you can continue to color correct the rest of these shots in the timeline, but if you don't want to, you can go ahead and move to the next sequence where we have all the color correction done, and we're going to move on to color grading. Okay, so now that we have all of our scenes corrected to our reference footage, we're going to move on to color grading. So for color grading, what I like to do, instead of adding more specific color effects to each shot, I'm going to go ahead and add something called an adjustment layer. And it's really nice in Premiere that you can do this, because what an adjustment layer does is we can pull it out here and we can extend it all over our shots here. It's basically an invisible layer that you can add effects onto, and what happens is it applies these effects to any type of clip that's underneath it here. So this is a quick way to add an overall color effect to all of our footage here, and it's going to affect them all at the same amount. And what's going to happen is we're going to add that color in here, and then we're going to go ahead and go into each shot individually and kind of tweak things just a little bit more to make sure everything truly is kind of consistent and everything's looking the way we want to. Let's hide this reference panel here. Let's go back to the effects and kind of even things out here. So let's go ahead and add another lumetri color effect onto our adjustment layer here. And from here, we kind of get to decide where we want to go with the look and tone of this film. For this film, it's more of a somber, kind of dark film and stuff like that. So we can go with more of a kind of a dark and muted tone. But the thing is about this scene, this is more of one of the happier scenes at the end of the film where everything is resolved in the end. So we might want to go with more of a bright and happier feel to it. So we might be more inclined to go with more of a bright and happier feel for it. So I think with those two factors in consideration, I think we're going to go more for kind of in the middle, sort of more of the cinematic kind of somber tone of it, but still kind of keeping that bright and gold happiness in the end here. So first of all, let's go ahead and go into our color tools here. I think what I want to do overall is I want to add a little bit, just a little bit more contrast overall in here, and keep that consistent throughout, just to really help make the colors pop. And let's go ahead and drop down to our curves here, and let's do some overall adjustments with our curves here. So the one big adjustment I like to do with kind of films like this that are going for this type of tone, I want to go to our blues here, and I want to go down to our blacks with the blues, and we're going to bring up the blue value in our blacks a little bit. And what that's going to do is you're going to notice there's a little bit more blue value now in her hair and in his jacket here and in his skin. It might be a little bit too much for this scene, so let's bring it down just a little bit. This is a pretty common trick that's used in a lot of films, kind of giving a little bit more color. And like I mentioned before, we're going to work kind of with contrasting colors here. So the contrasting color with blue is going to be yellow. So we can pull down the blue value here in our whites a bit to add a little bit more yellow into the whites. That's going to give it more of a golden look overall, especially in the sky and in the water here. And we're going to see kind of that look is being placed throughout. It's looking pretty good. And I think overall we can go ahead into the mid-tones of the blues and bring those down a bit, just to give it more of a kind of a yellowish tint. Again, when you're working, like when you see this, when you're working with films, you don't necessarily have to have a complete natural look to every film that you're working on. It's always good to do some type of color grading overall to add that kind of tone to your film, because it's not really supposed to look completely naturally, and that's the whole idea around color grading. You want to kind of craft things the way that you want them to look, and I think this kind of look is going to work pretty well for what we're doing here. So yeah, let's looking pretty good. Let's move up the color temperature overall just a little bit as well. Just even bring that warmth to a little bit more of a, like even to a bigger level here. So I think after we have that done, let's go ahead and maybe try to bring up our blues just a little bit more and see if that makes any more of a difference than it did before. So a good way to kind of look to see where things are going is go ahead and turn your adjustment layer off and then turn it back on, and you can kind of notice the difference of where we're going with it here. So, and it's looking pretty good so far. Let's go ahead and maybe experiment more with our reds here. Let's see what happens when I bring our reds down. This means we're adding a little bit more cyan into our blacks. Let's see what happens when we do that. And again, it's a lot about experimentation with this stuff. Okay, so we did that there. I'm not really liking how dark. I'm not really liking how dark that made the scene here, because there's a lot of reds in the shot, and the reds are making it look pretty nice. So I'm going to keep those reds in there. Maybe what I'll even do is I'll go ahead and I'll add some more reds into the black. And maybe I'll add a little bit more red overall. And look, yeah, so yeah, it's looking pretty good. When you're working with footage like this, when it's in log, especially when it's red footage, you have a lot of latitude of what you can do with color. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about it. Another thing we can try to do, it might not work for this situation, is we can go ahead and add kind of a look here in our creative factor here. And what's going to happen is right at first, it's going to be really drastic. But what we can do is we can turn down the intensity to it. And basically what this is kind of like a pre-made kind of a cinematic look, pre-made kind of cinematic look to a film. I honestly don't think it looks as great on its own by itself, but using it sparingly in conjunction with the color that I do kind of works out well for some scenes, and I think it's actually going to work out pretty well for the one that we're doing right now. Yeah, so things are looking pretty good so far looking through. I think one thing that we might want to do overall is maybe tone back the saturation a bit, but not too much. Basically, we've been looking at this shot the whole time, and things are looking pretty good here. Let's kind of do what we did before. Let's go ahead and take a photo of this shot and keep it into our project, and let's go ahead and look at our other shots and kind of compare it to what we did here and see if we can make things a little bit more consistent throughout. Okay, so let's go ahead and this shot. So this shot here, looking at it now with all of the adjustment layer on top of it, I think what we can do is we can kind of tone back that contrast a bit. Because I think the way this color is falling on this scene, falling on this scene is going to look better with a little less contrast in it for this situation. And yeah, and that's looking pretty good. I'm kind of liking where that is right now. I don't think there's a lot more that needs to be done with it. So let's move on to this one here. So this one here, because of the way the colors are showing up, the blues are showing up a little bit more overpowering than it does in this one. So let's go ahead and let's just compensate for that a bit by pulling the blue value and the blacks back a little bit. So what we're doing is we're adding a little bit more yellow back into them, and that already is making a pretty good difference here. And I think what we also need to do is I think we also need to bring the exposure just up a tad bit. That's already looking pretty good here. I think maybe it could just use a little bit more green in it, just a little bit maybe in the midtones overall here. but not to an extreme amount. Just a little bit more. Maybe pull up the greens and the whites a bit more. Yeah, and that's actually looking pretty good as well. I think maybe the last thing that we can do is we can tone down the saturation just a little bit. Because in these types of shots, the saturation tends to come out a little bit more. And just pull that down just a little bit. Not too much. Okay, cool. Looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and copy those effects and pull them onto the other shot. Awesome. Looking pretty good. Okay, let's jump to this shot. Okay, so for this shot here, it looks like some of our color corrections didn't really turn out as well as we thought they would in conjunction with the color grading that we did. So let's go ahead and let's fix a couple things. I think overall things are looking a little bit too warm, so let's tone that back a little bit. Let's pull that back just a little bit more. And I think things are looking a little bit too blue, especially in our blacks, so let's tone that back as well. So let's go into our curves and tone down the blues and our blacks a little bit. And I think overall, so if for reference, if we look at his kind of his black coat here, things are starting to match a little bit more well now. Not everything is as blue. So let's go ahead and also probably bring up our exposure a bit. That's looking pretty good. I think overall, I think there's a little bit too much of a warm tint on the whites overall. So let's bring up the blue tint on the whites to compensate for that. That's already looking better right now. I think maybe the last step that we can do is we can add a little bit more magenta in here. And probably just a little bit more green in the whites. And I think we'll be just about set to move on. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and look at this shot. This shot I think is looking pretty good. I don't think there's a lot that we can do, that we have to do on this one. Maybe just move up the exposure just a little, maybe pull down the blacks just a little bit, move up the exposure just a tad. But other than that, it's looking pretty good. Let's move on to our greener shot here. Now the color correction on the top made things just look a little bit too drastic here. It's actually looking pretty good. It's a pretty cool looking shot, but it's not. But we don't want it to be quite as drastic as it's looking here. So let's pull a little bit more. Let's pull a little bit of the magenta out of the blacks here. Kind of looking at the shoreline here. It's looking a little bit too magenta to me. So pulling those out a little bit, and let's pull a little bit. Let's put a little bit more blue back into it because it's looking a bit too gold in the blacks here. And that's looking pretty good as well. It's kind of a nice establishing shot here. We're kind of establishing how how the colors in the scene look and the kind of tone that this scene is going to have, and it kind of carries us throughout here. This one's looking pretty good as well. And yeah, so if we take one more look through everything, everything's looking pretty good. It's okay if things aren't exactly the same because every shot's kind of different. Every shot has its own lighting setup, but overall everything kind of has a consistent tone here when we're looking at the color grading. So things are looking pretty good. This is a good spot for our color correction to be right now. And what you probably want to do with your scene is you want to compare your scene with the rest of your film and see if everything kind of looks unified together in terms of tone and overall look. There might be one more color pass you want to do over your entire film. There might be little things like vignettes or film grain you want to add in to add a certain style. But overall, once you do these steps, you're going to be at a good spot with your color correction and your color grading for your scene. Of course, if we were doing more of an advanced color correction, we could do things like adding a power mask to his face to brighten it up a little bit. For some scenes like this, we could add a mask here and bring out more detail in the sky. Don't need to do that for this situation, but in some situations, that's an option that you have to do. But those are some more advanced options that you have to do if you want to take that extra step. Before you're completely done with your color correction and color grading for your film, you always want to try to preview the film that you're working on in whatever kind of medium that you're going to be showing it in. So if you're just showing it on a computer or online, it's okay to just see it on your computer. Might not be a bad idea to watch it on another person's computer to see how it looks on a different person's screen, because the colors are going to look a little different. If you're going to be showing this on TV, it's always good to hook up your project to a TV and see how it looks on there. If you're going to be showing this in a theater or on a screen, you're going to want to try to see if you can do a test screening where you can project your film on that screen. Because when you're viewing a film on a big screen, the colors aren't going to look exactly the same way as they do on your computer. An option you might want to consider is installing a monitor with a color profile on the monitor that's similar to a film projection screen. You can kind of simulate that color profile where you're working, and you can kind of do your color correction based on that profile in mind. So again, I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. If you have any additional topics you want me to cover on Digital Film Dojo, go ahead and feel free to leave those thoughts as well. Feel free to follow me on Twitter or Instagram if you want to keep up to date on what I'm working on and stuff that I do behind the scenes. And of course, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you can keep up to date with my weekly videos that I put out on filmmaking tips, tricks, and tutorials. I got some exciting stuff coming up in the next few weeks that you're not going to want to miss. I hope you all have a nice week, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye everyone.